Years ago, I encountered posters by an artist named Scott Mutter from a series he called Serrational Images, where he would meld two or more images together into a thought-provoking whole. This was decades before AI. So at first glance, they seem to be a simple image. Can we have the first one, please, Rosa? It seems to be a simple image. But when you look again, the city is built on a foundation consisting of a library. In the next photo, you have a city street running down the center aisle of a church. Art such as this invites us to look beyond that first quick glance to see the deeper possibilities as our imaginations are engaged. I also came across this next image. First glance, it's a deer crossing a road, right? Look again. Is it instead not a road crossing a forest? In what other areas of life do we often only notice the surface without taking the time to look further? I came across a website a few weeks ago that stated that United Methodists place an emphasis on service, on works for their salvation. You can go to back to the sermon slide. There we go. My knee-jerk reaction to this statement that Methodists place an emphasis on works for salvation was indignation. We do not. But then when I gave it some thought, I realized that, I can see how someone might get that idea just looking at the surface. I mean, after all, one of our membership vows is to serve the church by our service, our actions, our work. And there's an emphasis in United Methodism on social holiness that goes all the way back to the beginning, before the Methodist movement was even a movement, all the way back to when the Holy Club, a group of Oxford men, including John and Charles Wesley, began to meet together weekly because they wanted to hold each other accountable for their faith, their practices of their faith. And the Holy Club emphasized acts of piety, worship, prayer, meditation, fasting, and such. And the Holy Club also made deliberate effort to avoid doing evil, which would cause harm to their own souls, but also would harm others. So avoid, do no harm. And then they emphasized doing good. Visiting the sick and those in prison, taking the gospel to where the people were, even if it meant preaching in the parks and at crossroads, working to alleviate the suffering, comforting the afflicted, and lending solace to the grieving. Those were the things that they recognized would enable them to draw closer to God. And so they met week by week and checked to see how each was doing. With our vow to support the church by our prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness, it kind of does sound like we're advocating works as the way to righteousness. So I can see why someone on the outside looking in might say that. Of course, in that contradiction, we're in good company. In the book of James, from which Tony just read, James firmly upheld the doing of the word as absolutely essential to valid religion, valid faith. In the verses immediately preceding our passage, James warned that what we do will be taken into account at our judgment. So how does this fit with the crucial role given to faith throughout the New Testament, including by James himself, that faith is the source of our salvation? Like people who look at the United Methodist Church from the outside, isn't it possible to draw from a few verses the conclusion that James is just advocating works righteousness? That we gain our salvation through our works? But when we look closely at what James says, we see that the very nature of true Christian faith produces those works that are pleasing to God. In other words, if we have faith, if we have a relationship with God, then we will naturally begin to actively serve God and serve one another. If we have faith, if we have a relationship with God, then we will naturally begin to actively serve God and serve one another. One of the challenges with this whole question of salvation by faith or salvation by works or salvation by some combination of the two is that the meaning of the words used in this passage is not the same meaning of the same words used elsewhere. One commentator wrote, "These statements of James about being justified by works present a problem to the person who is aware that in Romans 3, Paul claimed that a person is justified by faith apart from observing the law. Faith only." And of course, the problems being dealt with in Romans and in James are quite different. You see, Paul is talking to and attacking people who think that salvation is tied to doing the Jewish laws. You know, they had, 600 and something laws, and they had been raised that you go through these and therefore you are right with God. So that salvation by the law, and Paul says, no, salvation is not tied to doing the Jewish law. Salvation is by faith alone. But James is addressing a different problem. James is addressing people who think that salvation doesn't bring any responsibility with it. And they're both right. Both Paul and James use the word justify, but they use it with different meanings. When Paul uses the word justify, he is talking about the initial acceptance of the sinner before God, the solely gracious act whereby God, the judge of all the world, considers us right before God because of our identification with Christ. In other words, when we choose to accept Christ and to accept that relationship, that God justifies us. And we are people of faith and we have our salvation. James, on the other hand, uses justify as the ultimate verdict of acquittal rendered over our lives. In Matthew 12, Jesus used the term in this way when he said, "By your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned." Now remember, James warned that what we do will be taken into account at our judgment. In Matthew 25, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, at the judgment the Lord separates the sheep and the goats, rewarding the sheep and punishing the goats, all because of the responses that they had made in life to people in need. The Lord said, "When I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick or in prison, you visited me." Or you didn't feed me or give me drink or clothes, nor did you visit. Jesus said, "For as much as you have done it to the least of these, you have done it unto me." Or for as much as you have not done it to the least of these, you have not done it to me. Now it's clear that the sheep and the goats both knew and followed Jesus. They both came when called. The only thing that separated them was what they did and didn't do. Now it's true that we are saved by faith in God through Jesus Christ, period. If you want to go to heaven, that's all you got to do. You got to have faith in God through Jesus Christ. But when we face judgment in that last day, we will be called to answer for how we lived our lives. Not before we entered the relationship with God, but how we lived them after we accepted God's gracious love. Now, I think the next question that James asked is key. If someone is naked and hungry, and all we do is say, "Go in peace, keep warm, eat your fill," but we don't provide for their bodily needs, James asks, what good is that? I'd maybe change that question to, how will you justify that when God asks? What excuses will we give for not caring for those in need? Now, I think I've gotten lost in the weeds a bit here. I want to bring us back because service is not just about what God will say to us when we face judgment. In the Discipleship Ministries resource, our membership vows, we have some of those out. I think we have them in the lobby. I know we have them in the office brochure rack. Reverend Stam wrote, Giving of ourselves and our time is an opportunity to be close to the way of Jesus. If we want to draw closer to God, closer to Jesus, spending our time and our energies in service will enable us to do just that. It will get us closer to God. Reverend Stam wrote, the key to being faithful is showing up, putting our bodies in places where people are in pain, putting ourselves in places where people are lonely, setting another place at the table for someone who is hungry. So much of faithfulness in the Christian life and in the Methodist life is an extension of that. We find our life in self-giving love. A brand new United Methodist at the age of 78, Ridge Pilcher, was excited about the call to service. She said it was not just an addendum. It was part of the major sense of who Methodists are. You don't have a choice. You have to be involved. Being active in your church means you do. You don't just say. You speak up, you speak out, and you walk out, and you do. She immediately got involved. Her church served meals to the homeless, and she joined the team, and quickly discovered that her main job was teaching the members of the church not to be afraid of the homeless. She wrote, when we have an opportunity to know people who live these lives, we are not able to pretend we don't know and must do what we can to change the situations, both for the individuals and for the community. She said, I met homeless people, and a lot of them are my friends, and we keep in touch because they are us. We're together. We connect, and that for me is what Jesus did. He didn't have those and us. He had we. Service doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't even have to be organized and calendared by the leadership of the church. Giving a neighbor a ride to the doctor or the grocery store, calling someone you haven't seen in a while, listening with genuine interest to the challenges of living, visiting someone who is homebound or in a care facility just to say hello. Think about it this way. If you had $86,400 and someone said to you, I need $3,600, we could do that, right? We have $86,400. We could give $3,600. It wouldn't hurt us. And we'd still have plenty left, right? And they would have what they need. Did you know that there are 86,400 seconds in a day? How difficult would it be to give 3,600 seconds to help someone? There are 525,600 minutes in a year. And that works out to 43,200 minutes in the month of November alone. Can you, will you commit 120 or 160 of those 43,200 minutes to pack up some food for impoverished, starving children, maybe? Join us at Feed My Starving Children on Tuesday at 2:30 or at 7 in the evening on the 28th of the month. 43,200 minutes, can you give 160 of those to feed hungry people? There are 10,080 minutes in a week. Can you, will you, give 120 of those so that the children might learn about love and about God? See Jenny and come be a shepherd at Sidewalk next Saturday and see about loving the children. 10,080 minutes in a week. Can you, will you, give 120 of those to help out in the Learning Center? One night a week? See Tony. Can't give that many consecutive minutes because the consecutive part is part of it. If we use our imagination, folks, we can come up with an unlimited number of things to do which will serve God and serve others, drawing us ever closer in the way of Jesus. From the outside, looking in, it does seem that we practice works righteousness, when in fact, what we practice is faith revealed by our works, our service, through which others might know the loving grace of God.